Cool.
Tommy, technical difficulties over here. Like, took us a while.
We left the gun. We took the cannoli.
I see what you did there. Wow, Blake, look at that. Did you do that intentionally? Because we're talking about the Godfather Part II.
Welcome to VCR Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And I'm Michael.
And yes, we are doing the Godfather Part II, the deep dive.
Woo! The deep dive.
Yeah, one of the best movies ever made, allegedly.
Allegedly. Ostensibly.
You have a bone to pick, maybe, but we'll get into it. We'll get into our personal opinions.
There's a lot to say about this movie.
There's a lot to talk about in this movie. This is going to be one of our longer episodes, I think.
Yeah, probably. Well, even our primer was it was more primed than usual. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we get started, I do want to just say as well, we're always recording these in advance a week or two kind of thing. What I want to say is that we're doing one of the most American movies ever made. The Godfather, The Godfather Part II even more so, I think, is a movie about America.
Mm-hmm.
And, given the current climate and the environment, I think you and I are choosing to only cover foreign movies going forward for the next foreseeable future.
Absolutely.
And that's going to include Canadian movies, British movies, Japanese movies, Chinese movies, like anything but America, and probably Russia as well, because fuck them too.
Yeah, no. Suck a dick.
So, yeah, I don't know. I think that's just something I want to put out there, that we have to stand in unity against some of the bullshit going on right now, and I think we'll do our small part.
Absolutely, right.
So,
our incredibly small part.
Yeah.
Our infinitesimally small part.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but
I think it's charming that the whole Geneva Convention was forged because apparently Canadian paratroopers were like the biggest psychos on the planet 100 years ago. So maybe we've still got some of that psychotic blood flowing through our veins.
Yeah, exactly. So, we're going to stick it to the man in our own way. And I'm actually kind of looking forward to it because there's a lot of movies that we don't get to cover because we don't do a ton of foreign movies on this podcast. Like occasionally we try to hit a few.
Yeah, every now and then.
Yeah, there's for example, there's a whole treasure trove of Kurosawa movies that I've never seen. Kobayashi movies, we've got a number of Canadian movies that I've never seen. I haven't seen very many
I took a Canadian cinema class all those years ago, and it was one of the best college classes I've ever taken.
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk Canadian movies, I'm your guy.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to kind of maybe a little bit of a change of pace for the next foreseeable future.
Yeah.
And we'll see how things go. I don't know. Maybe we'll never go back.
Maybe.
That's it. That's all I had for that part. So we should start talking The Godfather Part II. This is the spoiler-full episode, so if you've never
Spoilerific.
if you never watched The Godfather Part II, go do yourself a favor and listen to the primer, and then watch The Godfather Part I, and then watch The Godfather Part II. Because
and then come back. We'll be here. We'll wait.
There's a whole list of things that you need to do in order to watch this episode.
Yeah, really. But we will wait so patiently.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess part of what I want to start talking about with this movie, I guess its relationship to Part 1. I would put this movie on almost the same level as something like the Lord of the Rings series, where really to get a full picture, to get the full context of the story, you almost have to watch both of them in tandem.
Yeah, and we talked about this in the primer episode. It's really like a companion piece to Part 1.
It is.
It's almost not even really a sequel. It's like a companion piece.
Yeah, it's a continuation.
And you know what? That might not make sense to you if you haven't seen it, but if you have, you kind of know what I'm talking about.
But the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of those movies share a connective thread, and there's an overarching story taking place, and all of them have an order to them.
Right.
And you don't necessarily need to follow that order to get some enjoyment out of each movie. Whereas The Godfather Part II, because it's speaking so directly to The Godfather Part 1, I think that you need to watch both these movies side by side.
Back to back to back. Yeah.
Because The Godfather Part 1 it's the story of Michael's rise to power, right? While Vito is in the late stages of his career as the Godfather. It's a lot of event, decisions and executions of plans and that sort of thing.
It's got this incredible forward momentum.
Yeah, and this movie is the consequences of all of those decisions.
I think the two big things we need to talk about with this movie, and I was just kind of articulating this on the drive over, is we need to talk about Fredo.
Yeah.
We also just need to talk about the structure of this movie.
Yeah, even the structure is like drastically different than the first one.
Because like
right?
even if you like take a couple of steps back and like look at the whole map of the forest, it's a very different picture than part one.
Yes.
Some would argue to its detriment. Some might not argue that, but we'll see where we land on that one.
I might be more positive on it than you are. And I know getting through the primer episode, I think we both kind of got to an understanding where I think I like this movie more than you do. I think you respect this movie, but don't necessarily agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that multiple views and like how you watch it, watching it back to back with part one, like all of that kind of enhances the story. Because, you know, when we open this movie, it's actually interesting how they decide to open it, because I found that there's the opening shot of Michael right after the communion, and then it tracks immediately back to Vito's childhood. And
right, and what a childhood.
yeah, and it's interesting because The Godfather Part II almost has a more traditional start to a film than The Godfather Part I does. And I think the very first time I watched The Godfather 1, I was kind of disjointed from the intro, like the wedding and everything, and you kind of just get dropped off in the middle of a story. Whereas,
well, we open part one with, again, it's a very effective scene, but we open with Vito like already in control. Like we see him in action.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah,
he's receiving that guy who wants him to like rough up some thugs who had their way with his daughter.
right, yes, one of the most well shot intros of a movie ever. It's very, very starkly different to this one, where it's like there's kind of that narrative intro of like, you know, this is 1901 and Vito's father was murdered by the local Don. His brothers fled into the mountains to seek revenge, and him and his mom are in the process of burying and grieving their father.
Right. It's quite a scene. They're on their way to bury their husband and father, and then the oldest boy is immediately killed.
Right.
Right. Like the funeral erupts into a hail of gunfire.
Yeah. And then following that, Vito's mom tries to take the Don out with a knife, and that fails spectacularly.
Yeah.
And Vito escapes to America.
And we get that great shot of like he has to be quarantined because he got smallpox. So we see him like in his little room with like a little window view of the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah,
right?
right.
Maybe we should start this by talking about Vito himself as a character.
Yeah.
Here's something that I've been wrestling with these last few days is Vito a good person?
I think that to answer that question, you have to look at some of the themes of this movie and the themes that Coppola is, I think, trying to portray. Like, Vito is a representation of an idealism, of a earlier America, where the American dream is alive. And, you know, immigration, there's so many people moving to the States to try to capture the American dream. And it's this melding pot of everyone in the world, and they're almost their savior kind of place to show up in, right?
Yeah. Safe harbor.
Yeah, and so I think that Vito is actually a good person who is put into unfortunate situation. He's also a very intelligent character.
Yeah, he's very like canny, very adaptable, right?
Yeah.
I think we said last week, like, you know, Michael clearly got all his intelligence from Vito.
Right. Yeah. Well, and even more so, like Michael's probably even more intelligent than Vito. It's just Michael lacks any sort of compassion.
Well, I think there's something very tragic about Vito's life in a sense, right? So, first of all, he's chased out of Sicily by, you know, the local Don, right?
Yep.
He's fleeing Tommy Gunfire. You know, he settles in America. We flash forward a bit. He's suddenly played by a shockingly young Robert De Niro, right?
Yeah.
And then he's just kind of working as a simple grocer, but then there's this other Don.
Yeah.
He ends up losing his job because Finucci basically just wants his uncle or his nephew to have his job.
Yeah.
There's that great moment too when, like, you know, his boss basically comes up to him and is so, like, almost crying. He's so apologetic. And
right. Because
Vito
of his family.
Right. And Vito is so gracious about it. He doesn't put up a fight. He's just like, you've looked after me ever since I've came here. Like, you're like a father to me.
Yep.
Like, don't worry about it. Then he leaves. And then, the grocer tries to give him like a box of groceries and he won't even accept it, right? So
Yeah.
again, there's that like quiet nobility to Vito. Meanwhile, he has a wife and he's got kids on the way.
Yep.
He's living in this rundown apartment. A neighbor has him hide some guns for a bit. And then to reward him, he just steals a rug for him. That's a really weird scene, actually.
I kind of love that scene, but we're getting a little ahead here. So,
well, I'm trying to paint a picture that, like, so then, we can see that, like, there's something tragic with the fact that he had to flee Sicily because of crime. And now here in America, crime continues to beguile him at every turn.
Yeah, and I mean, that's probably the experience. That is the experience of the Italian experience in the early 1900s, right? Like,
yeah, and a lot of just immigrant experience, right?
Yeah, like the Black Hand is definitely a real organization. Like, it's the prototype of the mafia. What's interesting is the Black Hand is so much more extortionist, and it extorts the people, their own community, because there's nobody else looking after them.
Right.
And that kind of changes with the rise of Vito, because Vito does care deeply about his community. So, Vito is obviously importing drugs and guns and olive oil.
Stealing shit, yeah.
And stealing stuff and selling stolen fencing stuff. But on the flip side, like, he is willing to help out community members. He's willing to solve problems. He's working for the everyday person.
Yeah, there's that really amazing sequence where, this old widower, one of his wife's friends, she's being evicted from her apartment because of a dog. So then Vito goes to this barbershop and is like trying to like convince the guy to let her stay. At one point, he even offers to just pay some extra money on the side. And, like, he doesn't even want the widower knowing because he knows she'll feel bad. And the guy's such a prick about it. He storms off.
Right.
Then he finds out who Vito is and instantly comes crawling back on his hands and knees and, like, takes care of it. He lowers the rent, lets the dog stay, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I particularly like that sequence because I thought it really showcased the contrast between Vito and Michael.
Yes.
And that even though this guy is such a dick, Vito is still willing to use, like, diplomacy to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Like, his first instinct isn't like, I'm going to fuck this guy up.
Yeah. I think that Vito is actually inherently a good person who is put into the unfortunate circumstance of having to become the person that he became.
And it's kind of what I've arrived at, too. It's like, he's a good man trapped in a brutal system.
Yes.
And who's had to adopt a brutal role.
Yeah.
Now, on that note, he still decides to whack Finucci.
Yeah.
And what a satisfying sequence that is, right?
That might be one of the best scenes across all of the Godfather movies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a large part of it is just due to the lighting and the way that scene is set.
And like how it quietly just builds, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to paint the picture of that, right? Like, he's waiting for Finucci in his apartment building, and he turns off the light, and so he's in the darkness. He wraps the gun in the blanket.
Apparently that was a note by De Niro.
Yeah,
he was the one who said he should be hiding in a towel or something.
Yeah.
Even though it's very obviously a gun.
Yeah.
I did love the moment though when he comes up behind Finucci. Finucci turns around, smiles. It's like, what have you got there? And I'm like, bro, you're the worst mobster I've ever seen. How do you not know a gun when you see one?
Yeah. Well, and I love that Vito tests him in the scene before that, where he's like, I'm not going to pay Finucci.
So we should say, like, Finucci is like the local
extortionist.
The local extortionist. And, like, he knows that Vito is running this racket. So he chides him and he wants, like, what, like $150?
$200 each for each of the partners.
Just for, like, a little, like, to grease his palms, right?
Yeah.
By the way, I really liked Finucci as a villain.
Yes.
Just because of what a, like, spineless piece of shit he is.
Yes.
So basically, the whole idea with Finucci is, like, he's always dressed in these, like, elaborate white suits. And again, like I said last week, he just looks like a gangster.
He has, like, a demonic smile.
He's very, like, charming, but, like, in a very, like, unsettling way, right?
Yeah.
As it turns out, he's not even really associated with the Black Hand. He's just some guy.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Like,
and so Vito suspects that he is significantly weaker than the act that he puts on.
Right. So Vito goes to his friends and they're all like, well, we got to pay him, right?
Yeah.
Like, and Vito's like, what if we just give him we give him less money and then et cetera, et cetera. And Vito's like, I'll take care of it. Don't worry. Again, we're
Right.
seeing Vito's leadership skills. Then he goes to, he meets them alone at a coffee shop. It's almost like they're meeting for a date.
Yeah.
And he's just like, I only got $50 on me or something. And Finucci is actually kind of gracious about it. And he's like, oh, you're so bold not paying me. And he like pinches his cheek. He's like, I'll make sure to get some work for you.
Right. Yeah.
It's almost like he's like ruffling his hair, right?
Right.
And that's when Vito kind of realizes, oh, this guy, like I'm paraphrasing, obviously. He's like, this guy ain't shit.
Yeah.
So then he shoots him.
Yeah. Solves a whole lot of problems.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe also gets out to the community as well because he becomes a local hero.
And again, I kind of liked Finucci, even though like the whole deal is that like he's not nearly as intimidating as he looks.
Right.
Also, by the way, like the moment when he like puts the gun in Finucci's mouth and shoots it like a third time, I was like, oh, like
this movie doesn't shy away from violence, and it's very pragmatic violence as well.
Right. That was pretty brutal. Now, can we like springboard here for a sec? How do you feel about like the parallel structure of the movie?
Very conflicted is where I end up landing on it because
right.
If I had to choose which storyline I prefer or I get more enjoyment out of, it's actually the Vito storyline, which might be somewhat controversial, but I don't know. I find seeing that time in America very unique, and like the way it's presented in this movie, I don't know that I've seen portrayed in many other movies. And so, the immigrant story is one that's very powerful and it connects with a lot of people, and I really appreciate it, and I really like watching Vito as a child.
I do think it's interesting, too, how, like, the early Italian Americans at the turn of the century were just so impoverished and so poorly attended to that, like, the mob was almost the government, right? Like, I do particularly enjoy that scene where Vito has to resolve the dispute with the widower and her tenant, because it's like, yeah, you're a crime lord. You're also, like, who else is this poor woman going to turn to, right?
Definitely.
Yeah,
right.
And again, to Vito's credit, he solves the problem without bloodshed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He's almost like he's smiling watching this poor sweaty guy, like, stumble out of his shop. He's kind of just like, yeah.
I mean, the scene with the guy in the shop is the funniest scene in both Godfather movies.
Yeah.
Like, it's genuinely hilarious, especially because, like, Vito says nothing for the last half of the conversation. He just kind of has this bemused look on his face while this guy just, like, completely disintegrates in front of him.
Yeah, he just realized he was mouthing off to, like, a local mob boss, and now he has to go save face.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny when, like, one of Vito's friends, like, do you want some coffee? He's like, no, I can't stay for coffee. Maybe another time. And he's, like, tugging on the door and he can't open it. Yeah.
I love that, too, because this is a little inside baseball. We're not the effects of filming yet, but that's fine. The actor playing, I think his name was Roberto, the landlord, he is an Italian comedian. And so they didn't actually tell him that the door was going to be locked. And so what they did was they actually put a nail through the door handle. So when he first arrives, he doesn't know that door is going to be locked. So when he's struggling to get it open, that's actually because the door has actually been forcibly shut.
Pure cinema.
And it's the same thing when he leaves. The guy puts the nail back into the door so that he has to pull the nail out when he opens it for him. I think that was Sal, young Sal. All of that is kind of improvised from the comedian actor there. And I thought it was really, really funny.
That is really funny. Yeah. I actually did read Roger Ebert's review of this movie, and he had quite a bone of contention to pick with the dual structure. Can I read a quote for you?
Yeah, for sure.
So again, this is Roger Ebert's review. The flashbacks give Coppola the greatest difficulty in maintaining his pace and narrative force. The story of Michael, told chronologically and with the other material, would have had a really substantial impact, but Coppola prevents our complete involvement by breaking the tension. The flashbacks in New York to the early 1900s have a nostalgic tone, and the audience has to keep shifting gears. Coppola was reportedly advised by friends to forget the Don Vito material and stick with Michael, and that was good advice.
So I'm really conflicted about it because I do think that there are times when it does feel a little bit jarring, and I think that modern TV has maybe picked up on this as well, of like, raise the tension, something big happens, and then
Right.
the next episode of that TV show will be very different characters in a very different situation, and we don't get to see the results of the other episode.
Yeah, there's certainly an art form to like delayed gratification and stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's what this movie, I think, in a way, is trying to do. I mean, Ebert's not wrong. Like, it's very drastically different tones by design.
At the same time, some of my favorite scenes in this movie are from Vito's perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that it is an interesting parallel to draw between the rise of Vito and the fall of Michael.
I think maybe I would have liked it more if there was more like symmetry to it.
Yes.
Like if the parallels were a little more obvious. And you can see this in like, I don't know, I'm drawing a fucking blank right now. But like, so we see Vito using diplomacy to resolve a dispute.
Right.
Maybe then immediately before or immediately after, we see Michael immediately resorting to violence. Right?
Yeah.
If there was more like almost like match cutting,
Yeah, I agree. I think that maybe would have serviced the story a little bit better if you could see those direct parallels.
Or even if like, apparently there was a deleted scene with Hyman Roth in the Vito section.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe that would have been interesting, right? If like
Yeah.
even there was like some plot details that like were like set up in part 1 and then paid off in part 2.
Yeah, and I mean, circumstantially, like, it's unfortunate that the actor playing old Clemenza didn't return.
Yeah, that's what, to me, it's what makes it more of a companion piece than a true sequel.
Right.
Because there are some certain liberties like that just because of actors not returning, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. On the flip side, though, Bruno Kirby as young Clemenza is amazing.
Oh, yeah. Perfect.
Very great casting. Every scene that Clemenza is in is really great.
Clemenza! I don't know why I said it like that.
Like the scene where they steal the rug and there's this very distinct shot. Now, I don't know how burnt into your brain it is, but there's this shot of Clemenza at the window while the police officer's knocking on the door, and he's standing there with the gun up waiting for the cop to open the door.
I love that scene because you see this look across Vito's face like, I'm about to go to jail over a fucking rug.
Right. Yeah. And it's also like crazy too, because I think Clemenza is like, he's rough, right? Like he's a brute, and Vito is much more strategic than he is. And so without Vito, Clemenza isn't whole.
As much as I love Vito, I don't want to like, there's that great moment in part 1 where he's advises one of his brutes to like shake up the young men who beat up that one guy's, the funeral director's daughter.
Right.
And he has that line where he's like, we're not killers, or like, we're not murderers. And watching that movie again a couple of years ago, I'm like, aren't you though? Like, you're the mob, bro.
Yeah.
So like, I don't think Vito totally deserves to get let off the hook. Like, because he is still a criminal at the end of the day.
Yep.
Maybe he's more merciful than a man in his position would be, but like, you kind of get the sense that Vito would do well in any role he was in, right?
Yeah, he's just smart and capable.
Yeah, and I think there's almost, that also adds to like the quiet tragedy of these movies, is that you get the sense that like in another timeline, Vito would probably just be like running a chain of grocery stores.
Right.
And he'd probably be a lot happier.
Well,
and all his sons would be alive.
The other piece of this that we haven't really talked about as well is who Vito is doing crime against. And that is, it's always the wealthier people in the society that he's living in.
Hey, to those young writers at home, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. If your protagonist is a bad dude, but you still want the audience to sympathize with him, just make the antagonist slightly worse.
Yeah, I think you're missing what I'm saying, though. Like, I think that Vito is like a Robin Hood type of figure. And him being a Robin Hood type of figure is very, very starkly in contrast with Michael, who is a very capitalistic businessman.
Especially, like, even in the way they're... like Vito getting that rug for his family is a huge deal, right? He even has that line where he's talking to Clemenza, where Clemenza's like, what if I got you a rug? And he's just like, who has money for a rug?
Right.
And then he gets the rug and you see the little kids playing on it. And it's kind of like, Oh, okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
There's also that great scene where like I think it's Fredo. He's got like some kind of like chest infection, and like Carmilla and some other lady are attending to him, and this poor kid is like screaming his fucking head off.
Yep.
And Vito doesn't say anything, but he's just kind of standing slightly, he's standing in the hallway watching, and you can kind of see in his eyes realizing like, I want a better life for my children.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's very common to the people of this era. Like, I think about even my grandparents who lived in much worse conditions than we do. Like, and they worked really hard to acquire the wealth that they did.
Mm-hmm.
But they lived in a very different world than we live in. And like, they came up in a very different world.
Yeah.
I think that that's kind of the interesting mirror in this movie, is that Michael, and it's kind of sad too, because it's like, and you know what? Before I even get into this part, maybe the world that Coppola is showing in Vito's world, I don't even I wasn't there. I don't know if that world ever existed.
Yeah, maybe it's all just, you know what? One more thing on Vito before we move on. How did you feel about his fated reunion with the man who killed his parents and older brother, I guess?
I don't know. I thought it was really good. I don't know what you want.
I have a slight hot take.
Okay.
So basically, Vito goes to meet with the mob boss who destroyed his family.
Sissio.
The guy's old.
Yeah.
Like, old as fuck. Like,
right.
He's basically blind. He's basically deaf. He's clearly, like, not all that aware of what's going on cognitively.
Yep.
And then Vito stabs him in the gut. Here's my hot take.
What?
I think it might have been more powerful if Vito had just left. Like, without taking his revenge. I just feel like, again, if we want to highlight the contrast between Vito and Michael,
right?
Like, I think it would have been more meaningful if Vito just been like, all right, nice to meet you, and then just left, Like, this guy's clearly at death's door already, like...
Yeah, but I guess in that sense, it actually shows that, hey, Michael and Vito actually do share some similarities there, because that, you're bringing up a really good point that this man was obviously very close to death. And in the Michael timeline, that's something that gets brought up at least twice.
With Hyman Roth?
Yeah, with Hyman Roth, that, Hyman Roth's only got 6 months to live. And there's that great quote of Hyman Roth has been dying of the same heart attack for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Michael could also take the path, but with Vito, you have to think about the honor and the idealism. And Vito is a very honorable man, and his whole family was cut down by this man.
He was basically forced into a life of crime because of this guy.
Yeah.
I don't know. And maybe this is the sentimentalist in me. I just think it would have been more meaningful if he just, again, if the whole purpose of the dual narrative is to kind of highlight the difference between father and son, it might have meant more if Vito just been even if we saw him reaching for his knife and then decide against it at the last second, just
that would have been okay. I see where you're going, and I don't hate what you're saying. That might have been even stronger.
Granted,
but...
my whole family has not been killed, so maybe maybe if someone murdered my mom, father, and brother, I might be out for blood even 20 years later.
Well,
but...
and the knife too is a callback to his mom trying to stab
Oh, that's
Sissio.
a good point. I didn't really think of that.
Yeah. And also, even in that sense, Michael too avenges his family partway through part 1 when he kills the other Don and the police chief for...
Shoots him.
Yeah, for James Caan's murder.
Yeah.
For Sonny's murder.
Was that Sonny's murder? Wasn't Sonny's murder after that? I think Sonny was still alive. Yeah.
Oh no, it was the hit on. Oh my god.
Hit on his. He was protecting
Vito.
Protecting his dear old dad.
Yeah. It's been a couple years since I watched. Part 1,
we'll cut this out. So. Okay, we need to talk about Fredo.
Why don't we talk about Michael first and the other side of all of this?
Yeah.
We have a lot we need to talk about, but
yeah, I guess
I feel like Michael is more the natural transition here, because on the flip side to Vito's idealism and his coming to America and having to build this life from the ground up, Michael is inheriting this world. And Michael is a very intelligent man as well, but he's also very cruel and uncaring.
He is kind of a not good person.
What's really effective about this movie, and especially if you watch part 1 before this, is this movie drops you off, and it's actually, I think, takes place several months or if not a couple years after the events of the first movie.
I think it's a couple years.
Yeah, you know what? It's probably about 7 years, right? Because she says that you've been trying to make this business legitimate for 7 years. So it's years later, but the consequences of the first movie are very apparent, right? Like,
right.
Connie is just
flews it around.
Yeah, she's having multiple flings with different men. She's through her third marriage, I think.
I do love the scene where her and her like most recent beau go to meet with Michael. You know, Michael's pretty clearly like immediately hostile to the guy, and this douchebag is like, "Hey, can I like get a drink or something?" And Michael just looks at him, then looks away. Like, fuck you. You're not drinking my alcohol. You're not fucking my sister and drinking my alcohol.
And Connie's like even abandoned her kids. Like,
yeah, even Carmilla, like the mom.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I just want to say this before I forget. I would have liked more Carmilla.
I agree.
I would have liked. Michael kind of has that scene with her where he expresses fears that he's losing her family, and Carmilla is just kind of like, don't worry about it. And it's kind of like, you know, you are the wife to like the most noble, powerful Don in history. That's probably not true. I'm just saying it. But I'm like, can we get more from you? Like, what is... Right. And also, like, this life of crime killed your eldest son.
Right.
What's going on behind those eyes?
Yeah. I actually do agree that she wasn't as well utilized as she could have been in this movie.
Yeah.
But this is... On the flip side, though, as probably sexist as this might sound, this is a male movie. Like,
and we talked about this in the primer too, and even in our review of part 1. Like, there really is something to be said for the way women are treated in this movie, right? And how it's like, this is a man's world and women are not allowed in it. I particularly love the sequence where Michael meets with the senator. They have this very hostile exchange where the senator is being like openly racist.
Right.
And then Michael's like, my offer is nothing. And then the senator just like gets up, leaves the office, and his wife and Kay are talking outside. And as soon as he like leaves the office, he's like, hey guys, thanks so much for having me. Come on, honey, we gotta go. It's like, well, no, I loved that contrast where it's like this secret, hostile, conniving male world, and then like the more amiable, public-facing female world.
Right.
And how this senator just instantly switches back to it.
No, and speaking of contrast too, I love how Michael conducts business in comparison to Vito, because we see this mirrors the opening of part 1, right? Where Michael takes a succession of meetings, and with Vito, a lot of those meetings start community first, right? And it's about helping the community, and as things go on, it becomes more about business.
Right. Well, Vito even has that great line with the funeral director. He's like, you don't call me Godfather, like you never invite me over for coffee, you know?
And you know what? He doesn't even... I think he says at one point that they don't do business on the wedding day, right? Because all of them are like personal matters that he attends to in the opening scene.
Something like that, yeah.
And he has the 3 suitors, essentially. Whereas in this movie, I think Michael has a similar number of people come in, but they start off with like Michael's business interests first, and then the last person to see Michael is Frank Pentagelli, the man who's kind of operating the New York arm of the family at this point.
Yeah, the little, like the squirrely balding guy.
Yeah.
Which actually, that describes a lot of people in this movie, but...
You know, even before Frankie is able to have this meeting, you know, Frankie's mad because he's not allowed in, and he's like clearly like... He has a point. Frankie has a point that Michael does not respect this arm of the family anymore.
Yeah.
I like that there's the inclusion of Frankie going up and trying to get the orchestra to play his Italian music, and they kind of make it into a farce and they make fun of him.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's also just something, like, not to cut you off, even just the way, like, Michael's posture and the way he's dressed, there's something very, like, remote about him.
Right.
You know, there's something very distant about him.
Yeah, I mean, he's become a businessman. Like, he keeps saying he wants to make the business legitimate, and I do believe that, but I think that the reason why he's doing it is because he sees more money in it than anything else.
Yeah. Michael, it used to be about the murder. Now it's all about business.
Yeah, I think that's the other point of contrast that I want to make, is that for Michael, everything is about business and making more money, and it only becomes personal when other people make it personal, right? Whereas with Vito, everything feels about the community, and like Vito's helping people, and sure, yeah, Vito's making money and that's all great. Like Vito's basically Warren Buffett and Michael is basically Jeffrey Bezos. Yeah. Jeffrey Bezos.
Jeffrey Bezos. You know, ever since I shaved my head, someone said to me recently, like, you look like Jeff Bezos. And I like reached across the table, grabbed him by the collar. I'm like, say that again.
Get him, Jeff.
Yeah. But no, yeah, it's very... By the way, the scene where he climbs into bed with Kay and she's half asleep clearly, and she's just kind of like, oh, why'd you leave the drapes open? As soon as that happened, I was like, oh no. And then boom, hail of gunfire into the bedroom.
Yes.
I thought for sure Kay was dead.
Yeah.
But they survived somehow.
It's a pretty big moment. Like the movie up to this point, like Michael's side feels much more, it feels very dangerous, like the discussion with the senator and everything. Like,
yeah,
the legitimate side of the business is like even grimier than the family side of things.
Just to take a step back, I did particularly love how, again, there's just this sense of like the family being fractured and like breaking apart in those moments. Like, I did think it was kind of funny though, where, you know, they're all eating together and I forget, somebody is just like, oh, you guys seem happy. And then Talia Shire, Connie, is like, we were when Daddy was alive. Like, I want to like look over to Francis Ford Coppola and be like, dude, we get it. We got it. You didn't need to say that, but thanks.
Nice.
Like, and then, yeah, Michael's almost shot.
That's kind of like breaks up the quietness of this. Like, it always feels like very tense. Like, you know, and Michael's scenes, all of this business being conducted feels like very dirty and like there's a lot of blood on people's hands, even if it's like more metaphorical.
It feels
blood.
Like seedy, you know? Like, yeah, grimy.
And it kind of makes you also wonder like how much that actually happens, where big politicians actually just like casually extort businessmen.
You gotta wonder, right?
Yeah, exactly. But
also, I want to say, and this is jumping ahead a bit, so Tom Hagen goes to a whorehouse.
Yes.
And we see the senator on the ground with a towel around his waist, and there's a dead prostitute in bed with him.
Right.
Basically, they've framed him for the death of this prostitute.
Yes.
And Tom Hagen just very calmly and like very deliberately shakes this poor guy down.
Yep.
And actually, the moment when like the senator, so she's all like, you know, handcuffed to the bed frame, and he's like almost sheepishly like, oh, you know, it's just like a game, you know?
Right.
And then he gets the towel and he starts like kind of trying to clean up the blood. Like there's something very haunting about that moment.
And I love how that scene is written, because it doesn't outwardly, at no point does it outwardly say that he's been framed for this murder, but it's so heavily implied that it's impossible. It's almost impossible that it's not a framing.
Yeah, and I like how it ties into like how, I mean, I don't like it, obviously. I don't like dead prostitutes, but like it shows again how women are treated in this.
Yeah, they're pawns.
Yeah, they're pawns. And like, you know, wives and mothers are kept outside of this world, but like whores can be used as like bargaining chips.
Right.
They can be like casually disposed of and used as a bargaining chip.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like Tom Hagen even is just kind of like, didn't have a family, you know, it'll be like she never existed.
Yep.
Like, don't even worry about it.
Yep. And I'm sure there are plenty of other bodies buried out in the Nevada desert that have had the same existence.
Yeah, I know, right? Like, we got a mass grave. The Corleone mass grave. We'll just check her in there.
Yeah.
Ay. I do like how it's not immediately obvious what he's doing. So he goes to, what's his name?
After the shooting happens. I do like as well that this movie doesn't make us wonder who betrayed them. Whereas in part one, and this is kind of, again, the contrast between part one and part two. In part one, we don't know that it's Connie's husband who's betrayed the family.
Carlo, yeah.
Yeah, until it kind of becomes obvious on multiple watches, but I think the first time you watch this movie, you don't understand what's going on and how Carlo's kind of controlling the situation.
Yeah, really.
But in this movie, Michael's like, there must be a mole in the family. Tom, I trust you more than anybody in the world. I'm going to go deal with business. I need you to take care of things while I'm gone. And immediately after that, while they're openly wondering who is the rat,
cut to Fredo.
We cut to Fredo, who takes the call in the middle of the night, right?
Yeah. By the way, I love how him and it's like Johnny Ola, they have this huge tense exchange. And then, you know, his hot bimbo wife is just like, who is that, honey? And he's like, wrong number. I'm like, oh yeah, Fredo.
Fredo's great because, and we can start talking about Fredo now. Like dropping him off at the beginning of this movie, he's the most pathetic character of the Corleone family. Like nobody respects him. His wife, he's just got some hot wife who doesn't care about him anymore.
Yeah, and she starts like outwardly going off about how, to her credit, what little is due, she starts mouthing off about how he treats her like shit. And I'm like, Fredo's not really good at anything. He probably is not good at being a husband either.
Yeah, definitely.
So I was thinking about this recently. Like, he probably just married her because like he wanted to show off his hot wife to his brothers.
Right.
Well,
yeah. I mean, it's a status symbol for him in his world, right? Like he's in Vegas.
Yeah.
So he was kind of the first one out there controlling things. And even like Fredo, it's a continuation. His story is a continuation of part one, where he becomes like the lapdog of Mo Green, and Mo, at one point Michael has to like basically slap Fredo back into reality of like, you're in this family, and in our family, like, you don't betray yourself with anybody else. Like, you stick with the family. They're number one.
Yeah, he has that really chilling moment towards the end of part one where he's just like, Fredo, you're my brother and I love you, but don't ever take sides against the family.
Right. And it's very cryptic because it kind of foreshadows the events of part two, right?
Let me ask you this. So in the same way that I asked you, is Vito a good person? I have to ask, do you like Fredo?
I pity Fredo.
I did think it was really interesting how, as the movie went along, I don't know that I liked Fredo, but like, here's my thoughts on Fredo. This guy was born to the wrong family.
Yes.
I feel like
you got to expand on that one.
Here's my thing. Like, if this were an alternate timeline where the Corleones were grocers, like they always wanted, I think Fredo would be fine.
I don't know, because this type of Fredo character, and probably in part due to this movie, like kind of appears in a lot of crime families in future crime literature, film, TV shows, etc. Like, he's kind of the goofball screw up who...
Here's my thing though, like, if he were a goofball screw up to a family of grocers, the circumstances would not nearly be as dire.
Yeah, but that's just not the world we're in. I don't know if that comparison matters.
Well, excuse me, Blake. I'll take my comparisons to another podcast. I get what you're saying. I just feel like I don't think Fredo's that bad of a guy. But
the problem with Fredo is Fredo sees himself as like, nobody respects me. Everybody thinks that I'm dumb. Like, nobody ever asks me for anything. Like, I'm just, Fredo, go do this. Fredo, go do that. But the thing is Fredo he's such a hothead. He has no strategy. He's not strategy minded whatsoever.
I don't even think that he's a hothead. I think Fredo just, to maybe slightly abuse a meme here, like, Fredo just never understands the assignment.
Yeah.
Like, he even so he mouths off to like Johnny Ola, which almost gets his brother killed, and like, you get the sense that like he genuinely didn't understand that action might have consequences.
Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting, even in that sense too, that there is a chance that Fredo did know that Michael potentially could get murdered, because who else would have opened the drapes? Who else would have had the access to open the drapes in their bedroom other than somebody like Fredo?
I can't imagine that was Fredo. I think that was the assailants themselves.
It's possible though. It never actually makes that clear, and I think that's by design, that there's some ambiguity to some of this stuff.
Well, and like, going forward, I think the best scene in the movie, and this is what I would have picked for my one scene to sell the movie.
Yep.
I think it's like number 3 on Movie Clips, where it's like Fredo's like sitting down, they're kind of having this talk, and Fredo basically just starts, he finally reveals how much resentment he has for his brother, right?
Yes,
like,
that's one of the best scenes in the entire movie.
And like, Michael just kind of says like, I've always taken care of you, and Fredo finally snaps. He's like, you're my kid brother.
Right.
Like, like, he talks about how he was passed over and blah, blah, blah. And then he has that moment where he's like, I'm not stupid, I'm smart. Maybe not like everybody says, but I'm smart. And it's kind of like Bruno Kirby's character in Good Morning Vietnam. There's something very pitiful and very tragic about someone who has no self-awareness.
Right.
You know what I mean? Here, okay, Blake, guess what? I am a space cadet and I'm scatterbrained. I know that about myself, right?
Yeah.
That's why I would make a bad mob boss, and a bad lot of other things. But again, like he starts mouthing off about how he's smart and how he resents his brother, and I'm kind of like, Fredo, really? At the same time, like, I get it though, right?
I think that because Fredo is not intelligent, and in spite of that, like, he was raised in a family where all of the traits that his family required to be what they are just absent in Fredo. Like, Fredo is kind of a bit of a party boy, like a goofball. Like, he's the guy that you present to the customers to have a good time.
I feel like Fredo would have had a great career in sales. And you know what? To Michael's and Fredo's credit, he's the one who says, like, I got some guys coming down. I want you to show them a good time.
Yep.
Right?
Well, and I think Michael positions Fredo to succeed as best that he can.
Well, I think Michael kind of just realizes, like, Fredo is charming and, like, unassuming. So,
Yep.
like, maybe, like, if Fredo had been content in that role, maybe he could have just been the party boy.
But that's, again, there's a pride to Fredo, and there's like a self-assuredness, and I guess maybe self-assuredness isn't even the right word, because I think Fredo is highly self-conscious, and I even don't think that I believe when Fredo's screaming at Michael about him being smart that he even believes that himself.
There's definitely got to be some kind of like self-esteem issues going on here, right?
Well, what I actually even like about that scene that I want to note too is how much they make Fredo look like Vito in that scene.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of reminds you that, like, Vito was the older brother here, but he's just not capable of running this the same way that Michael could.
No, exactly. Michael's got that, like, deadly calculate. He's got that Machiavellian shit going on, and Fredo just doesn't have it.
Yeah, and Michael's, like, 3 steps ahead of everybody at all times.
Yeah, well, like, it's kind of funny. Even in part 1, when he has that heart-to-heart with his dad even kind of admits, like, Vito kind of admits, like, Sonny wasn't really cut out for this.
Yeah.
And it's like, in Fredo...
yeah, he just, like, ends the sentence.
Yeah, but
yeah.
like Michael is clearly the real inheritor of this kingdom, for good or for ill.
Right.
For ill, I take it back. I do find it kind of funny too when Michael pulls Tom Hagen close and he's like, "I need you to run things while I investigate this," and he's like, "You're the one I could trust," and he basically says, I could trust Fredo, but he's weak and stupid.
Yeah,
fuck. Like, he's not even hiding it. Here's the thing, though, like, towards the end of this movie, I do feel like I start liking Fredo a little bit more, or at least feeling more towards him. Like, the scenes with Fredo and Anthony, Michael's son, are actually genuinely heartwarming.
Yeah.
As bad at everything as Fredo is, he would have been a good uncle.
I think that's Fredo finally hitting rock bottom, and I think that's the true tragedy of the end of the movie, is that in Fredo hitting rock bottom and finally understanding his place in the family, it's too late in Michael's eyes.
Yeah, and Michael's still... So I also, before we get to that, I wanted to say that scene where he's talking to Anthony and he's talking about how when he was a kid, his dad took him and his brothers out fishing, and he caught more fishes than his brothers because he would say a Hail Mary every time he threw the lyre out. There's something so pitiful and so sad about him recounting this memory, because to me, I'm like, of course you remember. Like, this is the one time you beat your brothers. Like,
that's a good point.
Of course, like, that's probably like the happiest moment of your life.
Yeah.
The one time you were better than Sonny and Michael and Tom at something.
Right. No, that's a great point. I never even thought about that.
Yeah. That final scene where, like, he's out on the boat with whoever, and...
Yeah, it's the bodyguard, like Michael's bodyguard. His name's like Al Vera or something.
Yeah,
like
and
that.
he's supposed to take Anthony with him, but then Anthony gets pulled inside for something, and then, he basically just says, like, we'll go fishing another time, right?
Right.
And then he goes out there alone on the water. He says the Hail Mary, and then I do find it interesting that we don't actually see the bullet enter his brain.
Right.
We cut to Michael watching.
Yes.
There's something really pitiful about that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that this movie is very effective. Like, I think the latter half of the movie is really strong in the way that, Michael completely disowns Fredo, and then he says to his henchmen, no ill will befall Fredo. as long as my mother is alive.
Right.
And as soon as she's out of the way, and even like, and Connie begs for Michael to like forgive Fredo. And, you know, there's that scene where they interact with each other after Michael says, I'm never going to interact with you again. And there's that brief moment of like, maybe this can be happy. Maybe this fence
can be mended.
Yeah. And then there's the nod. One of the greatest nods in the history of cinema.
Like, kill this fucker.
Yeah. Honestly, Al Pacino in this movie, I think that this is his best performance in film. You could maybe make an argument to me that Dog Day Afternoon is a better performance.
I like his performance in Dog Day Afternoon more, but I'm not prepared to defend that.
That's fair. But I think that it's all of the little looks that Michael has in this movie, and like you can see the wheels turning and like the different plots and planning happen on his face and like read that in him. It's a much more subtle performance even than Dog Day Afternoon, but I mean it's one of those two movies I would say are conversation for two of the best performances of all time as well.
Yeah, easily. Jumping ahead a bit, I think the final scene of this movie is genuinely one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen. It's like 1944. The U.S. has just entered the war in Europe. You know, everybody's there. They're waiting for Vito to attend. And, like, we get James Caan returning as Sonny. And, by the way, did you know that James Caan was paid his full salary for part one for that one scene?
Right.
That's pretty fucking awesome.
Yeah.
Like, good for him.
Yeah. I mean, you got to negotiate, right? When your cards are...
When you got a winning hand, you got to play it.
Yeah.
So, and then, like, Michael, they argue about, like, you know, whether or not the U.S. should even be interfering in World War II, and Michael reveals that he's enlisted.
Right.
And then, you know, there's that great moment with Tom where he's like, well, you know, we pulled a lot of strings to get you into that university, and your dad has big plans for you. And Michael kind of gets a little offended. He's like, oh, you have plans for my future?
Right.
And it's kind of sad because it's like, oh, yeah, this was like a young, idealistic Michael who didn't want to be involved in the life of crime.
Right.
This is a young, idealistic Michael who wanted to, like, chart his own path.
That's actually a good note. I've been trying to figure out why that scene gets included in this movie for a long time. And there's something to be said about that, about the comparison of Michael and Vito, and how Michael actually is more idealistic like his father in that scene rather than becoming
That's a good point.
Powerful leader.
He's actually more like Vito in that scene than he is when he takes over.
Yeah. That's super interesting.
And then I really love the detail about how, like, Fredo is the only one who's supportive.
Yeah.
He's the only one who's like, oh, that's great, Mike. And he goes to shake his hand. And then James Caan, like, nah. And he, like, slaps his arm away.
Right. Yeah.
So.
And then Michael's the cause of, like, 2 or 3 people in that room's deaths, like Fredo, Carlo, Sal.
I love the mention, like, the detail that Sonny actually introduced Carlo and his sister.
Yes. Yeah.
It's almost like, and again, it just shows how patriarchal this society is. Like, he basically drags Carlo and he's like, hey, this is my kid sister Connie. He's like, hey, look how handsome he is. And
hey,
like,
go look at the tree.
Yeah. He's like, you two talk to each other. Like, yeah. It's basically just like, here, I picked your husband for you. Like,
yeah. Definitely.
Also, I love that when James Caan is, like, raging out because he's upset at his brother, you hear one of the kids in the background being like, Mommy, Daddy's fighting again. Yeah.
And I mean, at the end of the day, Sonny is
Sonny.
Like, he's upset. Like, but the way that Sonny reacts is always with violence. Like, literally always.
Always with aggression. I also love the detail that, like, he almost, like, attacks Michael.
Yeah.
Like, they pull him off, but then in the process, he, like, knocked his chair over, and, like, Fredo very calmly just, like, rights his chair for him.
Right.
And it's almost a little bit like, yeah, I guess that's Fredo's role, right? He's just quietly, like, you know, in the background, like, writing things when they need to be righted, I guess.
Yep.
I did really love, and God, I love James Caan so much. Like, I do love how he, like, you know, he's clearly angry and freaking out, but, like, you can see that, like, it's because he's scared that his brother's going to die, right?
Yep.
And he's able to convey those two emotions simultaneously.
Yeah.
As well, I want to point out, what's his ass? Marlon Brando, what's his nuts, was supposed to show up in that scene as Vito.
Yeah.
But he fucking bailed out at the last second.
Literally just didn't show up that day to
so,
filming, and they had to rewrite that scene really quickly.
At the same time, though, I think him not showing up makes the scene more powerful. Because, you know, he shows up in the background, the whole family rushes out, and we get that shot of Michael just sitting alone at the table.
Right.
And I think that's more powerful because then we cut to Michael as a middle-aged man just sitting by the water. Alone, just staring out across the sea.
And that's where, like, I kind of mentioned Breaking Bad in the primer episode, and I think that the story of Michael and the story of Walter White are very similar stories.
Yeah, and I want to read another sentence from Roger Ebert's review. He says, quote, "By the film's end, Michael has been abandoned by almost everyone except those who work for him and fear him, and he is a very lonely man."
Yes.
End quote.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the capitalism that Coppola is raging against, that to be successful in this world that Michael lives in, and unfortunately this world has not improved since Michael's time, you have to be cutthroat, you have to take no prisoners, and there's no room for compassion in this world.
Well, even like with Fredo, like he's just kind of like, like he's basically almost just decided like he's a weak link. Just kill him. Get him out of here.
I mean, I get it, though, because I think one of the most powerful scenes of the whole movie is when Michael finally realizes that it is really his brother. And I think the signs are all there. And if Michael didn't care for his brother at all, he would have offed his brother or called out his brother earlier, because Fredo's a terrible liar.
Oh, yeah. He sucks at it.
and so the moment where they go to that weird show in Cuba.
Yeah.
And Fredo lets it slip that Johnny, Ola, and him are actually buddy-buddy, and Michael's in the back, and he just starts silently screaming. I think that's an extraordinarily powerful scene.
I did love when New Year's happens, and he just comes up and, like, grabs his brother, kisses him, and then he's just like, "You broke my heart, Fredo.
I know it was you, Fredo. You broke my heart. You broke my heart!"
Yeah.
One of the best lines of the whole movie.
I know. And, like, you got to give it to Pacino. Like, he sells just the anguish in that moment.
Yes.
And then to his credit, like, when the Cuban Revolution starts and he, like, is getting into his car, Fredo kind of runs away. And Michael's kind of like, "What are you doing? Like, get in the car. Like, you're still my brother." Like, you know?
So, I want to come back to Cuba at some point, but I do want to also note that because Michael is so devoid of compassion and being able to connect emotionally with anybody, like, that's the constant undoing of his character, right? Like, he effectively, like, doesn't let Kay into anything. Like, he kind of holds her at arm's length at all times, and you know, they had a loving relationship at the beginning of the first movie, but by this part of the movie, like, there are large swaths of the movie where they don't even speak to each other.
So can we talk about Kay?
Yes.
So she's barely in the movie by design. That's just, Michael is clearly, again, like you said, holding her at arm's length. When he returns from Cuba, he's told by Tom Hagen that he had a miscarriage. She had a miscarriage.
And he's told by Tom.
Yeah.
Which is, like, wild.
Brutal, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I think there's also another moment where Michael's talking to Tom or something. He's like, "Yeah, give my son a gift." And he's just like, "Get him this and this and this," right?
Right.
Like, he's just really...
Because, again, compassion and understanding how to interact with people is just not in Michael's wheelhouse. It's like...
No.
It's all transactional.
So then he's talking to Kay, like, after he's been acquitted of everything, and she basically just... She reveals that it wasn't a miscarriage. She had an abortion.
Yes, one of the other, like, extraordinarily powerful scenes in the movie.
Right. Just that, like, she can't bear to bring another one of his children into the world.
Right.
And he flips out. Yeah. There are moments in this movie where we see the actor Al Pacino is going to become. Right? He even, like, slaps her and everything.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to share is I was talking to my mom about this movie, and she actually remembers seeing it in theaters.
Wow.
And there's this really brutal moment towards the end of the movie where Kay is, like, visiting her children, and Connie's very much like, "You need to leave. Michael is coming."
Right.
And then she's kind of takes her time to leave, and then at one point she's kind of standing by the front door, and she's like, "Anthony, give your mom a hug." Mm-hmm. And then Michael walks in, and it's like all the color drains from the room.
Right.
And he very, very slowly and very, very calmly crosses the room and, like, shuts the door in her face.
Mm-hmm.
So this is true. My mom remembers seeing this movie in theaters, and that when Michael slammed the door in her face, the audience cheered.
Wow.
Listen, 1974 viewers, it's not the emotion Coppola was going for.
Jeez.
Yeah.
That's wild.
That is wild.
I think that scene when she's like, it was an abortion, Michael, is one of the most epic betrayals in all of cinematic history.
Yeah, right?
It's truly like, it's even more horrifying than anything that Fredo does in the entire film.
Well, it's also horrifying because it's not elaborated upon. Like,
Right.
did you have a doctor come over and do it? Like, did you do it yourself? Like,
I don't know. I didn't even think about that.
yeah. I don't know. It's not elaborated upon, right?
I don't,
Why are you laughing?
that's such a random thought.
Yeah.
That never crossed my mind. I'm going to be honest.
Okay, well, whatever. Maybe you're the weird one.
That's so funny. No, I just think that like it's just it's a betrayal to everything, and like, you know, even today, like whether you're for abortion or not, I think we're all in agreement that, you know, having a baby aborted without the knowledge of your other spouse,
just because you hate your spouse so much that like you don't want to bring more.
Yeah, and then
people.
using it as a weapon is really would make you jump back, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's something very memorable about that scene.
I know, right? There's that really poignant scene when Michael's leaving to go investigate the assassination, and he visits his kid, Anthony, in bed, and he's basically just like, I gotta go for a while, and Anthony's like, can I come with you? And then Michael says, no, but you can help me someday.
Right.
That moment made my blood run cold, because it's like, oh yeah, like, Anthony has been born into a mob family.
Yes.
Like, at some point, he's gonna inherit all this.
Well, there's some sort of implication that Anthony is maybe too, like, maybe he has some sort of mental thing, or there's something like he's too gentle, or like, I don't know what it is, but it feels like there's an inference that Anthony will not be moving into Michael's role, that child that him and Kay were going to have was going to be the next like inheritor.
Okay, I didn't pick up on any of that for Anthony. Huh.
I kind of thought that that's what made the abortion feel more impactful, because she even yells at him too, like that he was a son, and like, and I know how much that meant to you, and now it's gone. And I think that was the kind of the implication, and I kind of wonder if there was something more that got cut related to that.
Yeah, potentially.
So I'm not 100% sure, but that's just how I read that. But let's circle back to the Cuba scenes, because I want to talk about Cuba, and I just remembered that we were just talking about it.
We're just talking about Cuba.
I again, this is kind of one of those other like points where it takes the movie into like a little piece of history. And I love when TV shows, like Mad Men's a really great example of this, where
You love Mad Men.
Mad
Yeah.
Men. One of the best TV shows ever made. And Mad Men fits in all of these historic events that happen over the 60s into the narrative of the show, and how it actually impacts the characters in real life. Because, you know, like even real world events like today, like there's not like big cinematic things happening to the average person in everyday life. But
Nope.
the ramifications of the big news stories of our time are the things that, you know, they impact our lives going forward, right? And so
Yes.
when a narrative can like a story can weave that into the narrative and show like these characters responding in real time to that, I think is really effective. And so
Turns out Michael Corleone was there during the Cuban Revolution. Yeah. It's almost like Forrest Gump being there.
I was
too.
about to
Yeah.
make the Forrest Gump reference too. That's so funny. He just
Yeah.
popped into my head.
There you go.
No, I think as like, if you're into history, like that scene's, again, one of those scenes where I kind of leaned into where I was like, oh, this is really cool getting to see like a revolution happen in front of our eyes here. And it fits really well narratively into the story, because Hyman Roth is down there doing some investing in the Cuban
Doing
government.
some shady shit.
Yeah, doing some business down there, and he wants Michael to get involved in the business, although it's more like Hyman wants his money and then is going to cut him out at some point. I think that there's something really interesting about how Michael even like views the events of the Cuban Revolution happening in front of his eyes, and how that impacts like his business decisions, right? Because
Yeah.
he sees there's a scene where the revolutionaries are all taken out of probably some sort of like
Protest or some shit.
yeah, or maybe they've got like some sort of secret base of operations, and they're all pulled out onto the street, and then the one revolutionary like tries to run away, and he blows up like a car as his last like final act of defiance.
Yeah,
right?
I know. And Michael's just kind of like, hey, like, are we sure this is a good idea? And they're just like, don't worry about it.
Yeah, and I think Michael's, again, it shows like Michael's intelligence and understanding of like the big picture of things, where it's
I did think it was kind of funny that they obviously included that scene because they wanted to showcase Michael's intelligence. But it's like, if I saw a guy pull a grenade and blow two guys up, it doesn't take a galaxy brain to be like, hey, maybe we shouldn't do business here.
yes,
I'm being a little shitty.
well, I don't know how to phrase this, but like I think that's a very traumatic event, and especially like somebody coming from North America where things historically have been much more stable, to see somebody blow themselves up like that. And then Michael makes the point after of like, these revolutionaries are fighting just strictly because of their cause. They're not getting paid by the military.
Yeah, exactly.
And how secure do you really feel in light of that? But I think that a lot of people would see that and go, oh my God, that was horrifying. And like, they're shocked, and like, they don't really think about the implication of what that means. Whereas Michael cuts right to it, and he's like, so that's what this means here. And because of that, I'm not going to invest.
I think we need to get the fuck out of here, guys.
Yeah. I even love like, there's the onset of the revolution, and then it happens like during the New Year's party, and they're all partying and everything. And it almost like there's a brief moment of like, this is the apocalypse kind of thing, and everybody's trying to flee the country all at once.
I did say I was very affected by like the Cuban governor or something. Just
he's the president.
The president steps up on stage and he's basically just kind of says, yeah, so like, I'm surrendering.
Yeah.
Like, good luck, everybody. And it's just like, can you imagine being at a party and like the prime minister is just like, yeah, I'm resigning. Everything's fucked. Good luck.
Yeah.
You'd shit your pants.
Yeah, it's terrifying. Like,
Yeah.
and it's chaos, and like, it's genuinely scary because, we haven't had that happen to us, but like,
Not yet.
yeah, not yet. But in the last 5 years, like, the America pulled out of Afghanistan, for example.
Yeah, and that went horribly.
Yeah, and like, we saw similar scenes play out to this movie, right? And it's like, it's deeply affecting when that's something that happens every few years around the world. Like, and Haiti's another good example of that too, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I thought that everything happening in Cuba is really wild, and like you mentioned, the good luck from the president is crazy. So I'm glad that got included in there, because I think a lesser version of this movie doesn't include like those world events, and it just cuts to the chase.
Yeah. Well, I gotta be a little shitty again. I think a lot of the stuff in the middle of this movie kind of lost me.
Right.
Even Roger Ebert in his review said that like, it's a little bit difficult to follow what's going on at times.
It's certainly difficult to follow, and that's where multiple viewings do enhance the experience.
Yeah, like, again, and I'm not even Roger Ebert's talking about, there was that attempted assassination with in the bar.
Yep.
Even Roger Ebert was like, I'm not even sure who ordered that.
Yeah, it's really hard to follow, and you bring up a good point too, because I think part of the other reason why that's somewhat hard to follow is because Michael's playing all sides at this point in time.
Yeah.
Like, he's told Hyman Roth, oh, I think Frankie's the one who tried to kill me. I don't want you to murder him, but eventually, like, I will take care of this. And then he says to Frankie, oh, I know Hyman Roth is behind this. I don't want you to attack the Rosada brothers because I have plans. And if you read into, I guess, the story and actually how this takes place, and maybe this is a good time to kind of explain it. So Michael sets up a meeting between Frankie and the Rosado brothers
right
at the bar. And so that is a pre-planned meeting that they set up, and he's basically like, I want to make peace between these guys because they're connected to Hyman Roth. So I'm at the top of our family. Hyman Roth's the top of their family. We're getting along. You guys also need to get along.
It is kind of funny. It's almost like parents scolding their children for not getting along.
Right. And so the reason why Frankie goes there is because Frankie thinks that he is safe because Michael has struck this deal with him. And then to kind of make things even more confusing, the one character, when he starts strangling or guillotining, what do you call that when you...
I think that's garroting.
Garroting, yeah.
Yeah.
When he starts garroting Frankie, he says Michael Corleone says hello, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of throws things into question as well of like, is this Michael? But, you know, if you do that, like, you probably wouldn't necessarily say that if you weren't framing Michael for this. What's really cool is that actually essentially happened in real life. Like, there was a mobster who almost got killed, and then a policeman just happened to walk into the bar just as it was happening.
Oof.
And stopped it. So
Yeah, and he kind of just wanders in like, are you guys open?
yeah, like, what's going on?
Yeah, and then
it's
it
great.
devolves into a huge shootout.
I do agree that that's really confusing and hard to follow. Like, and Hyman Roth is certainly not the strongest villain of the series.
You know, he's very, like, he's an old, infirm man.
Right.
He's very clearly in poor health. Apparently, they chose to do that because Lee Strasberg got super sick.
Yes.
When they were in the Dominican Republic for the Cuba scenes.
Yep.
There is a way to make a decrepit old man intimidating, but, like, it is a little... I'm just going to say, like, cards on the table, a lot of the action set pieces in Michael's sequences, Michael's half of the narrative, I do feel often fall a little flat. Maybe not flat, but they're like, to me, they're the least compelling parts of the movie.
Yeah, and I kind of said too that I prefer Vito's narrative because I think Vito's story plays a little bit closer to the feel of the vibe of part one.
I also have to say that, like, at one point it's revealed that Hyman Moth was sort of like
Hyman Roth.
That's his name, isn't it?
You called him Hyman Moth.
Oh.
His name is Hyman Roth.
So when Hyman Moth is talking to... I'm just going to keep calling him that. I don't give a shit.
Mothman. What's Mothma?
Mothra.
Mothra.
From Godzilla.
No, I'm thinking of the guy from Star Wars. Isn't there like a guy named Moth something?
Moth Gideon? I'm just spitballing here. I hope you leave this in, by the way. So when Hyman Roth is talking to Michael and he reveals that he actually had like a mentor-protege relationship with Mo Green.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, it's played as like this big reveal, like, oh fuck, like Hyman Roth is like nursing this vendetta against Michael because he killed his former protege.
Right.
I have to admit, that fell a little flat to me.
Right.
Well, you know what? It just, and maybe this is the writer in me. Part of me was like, this felt like a clumsy motivation.
So here's the thing, though, and I think that this, again, it's enhanced if you watch both these movies back to back.
I suppose.
There's this ongoing thing where it's like a character says it's not personal, it's just business. And every time a character says that, it's actually deeply personal and it's not business whatsoever.
Well, and it's funny, too, how, like, you know, all these men talk about like honor and family and all this shit, but they're all like adulterous murderers behind the scenes.
Exactly. And I think that that kind of perspective is enhanced if you watch both of them together, whereas this one kind of just assumes that you deeply understand the first movie, and therefore when something like that happens, it's like, okay, you've already kind of been prepped for something like that.
I suppose it ties into the theme too of like the consequences of violence. Something about that reveal just really didn't work for me.
I agree. It does fall flat, and I think that a large part of that is because you and I didn't rewatch the first movie immediately before watching this one. Because I think it's a little bit more impactful. Because, yeah, Mo Green's only in a little bit of the first movie, but he's actually really good in the first movie.
Yeah, no, he has that great line where he's like, I made my bones when you were going out with cheerleaders.
Yeah. Also, if you understand like the real world history, like the Mo Green, I can't remember if Mo Green's a real person or if he's a stand-in for another person. I think Mo Green's an actual real person, and Mo Green's kind of like the father of Vegas.
Kind of, yeah. He's the guy, like, even, like, I mean, not even, but like Fredo doesn't want Michael intimidating him and all that shit.
Yeah. And there's something to say about like how powerful of a person Mo Green was, and he actually was shot while... Yeah, I'm remembering all this from when we did the first part, where he was a real person, he was actually murdered while getting a massage, like all of that was actually true.
Got shot through the glasses, yeah.
Yeah. So he's such a big character, but because he's only briefly in parts of part one, it does kind of feel a little lackluster because you don't remember how big of a character. And if you haven't read about the history or understand the history of Vegas and Mo Green, then I think it doesn't feel as important.
No. You know, Hyman Roth is like a powerful mob boss. I almost don't know that he needs a
Yeah, a
I
motivation.
don't even think he needs extra motivation. Like,
Right.
Maybe he's just a dick.
Well, I mean, he kind of just throws it back in Michael's face of like, again, it's just business. Like don't worry too much about the shady things that I do or the shady things that you do. At the end of the day, we're here to make money, basically, right?
Yeah, really.
I do like how Hyman gets assassinated at the end, like basically like Lee Harvey Oswald.
Well, even like Tom Hagen's kind of like, well, there's no way to get to him, and Michael's just kind of like, fuck off. Of course, there's a way to get to him.
If history has taught us anything,
yeah,
is that anybody can be killed at any time.
Yeah, no fucking kidding.
Love it. I love that quote too. I probably said it wrong, but we should talk the results of the implication of Frankie almost being assassinated, and then him, and in the background, and again, this is kind of hard to follow, but essentially the reason why the hearings, the federal hearings over the Corleone family, the reason why they all start is because Hyman Roth essentially kind of wheels and deals in the background and actually gets the senators to investigate Michael.
Mm-hmm.
And they even, like, in a twist of fate, because they didn't manage to kill Frankie, Frankie thinks that Michael actually was the one who set him up, because Michael did set up that meeting.
He sure did, yeah.
And so Frankie actually like testifies, or is going to testify against Michael. He's like their all-star witness who's going to finally put Michael's family's to jail, kind of thing, right? And what they do is kind of interesting, but I think that, like, it's a little confusing because you don't really understand the implication of it until after, where this man just shows up and he's in the courtroom and Frankie just sees him, and all that takes, like, Frankie just seeing this family member just completely, like, he's like, you know what, like, I've made a mistake here, and he very hilariously, like, perjures himself on the stand.
I know, right? It is, so basically the idea is, like, they fly in his older brother from Sicily. Frankie sees him and then just immediately reneges on everything, right?
Yeah.
He even has that line. He's like, hey, they were asking me a bunch of questions, and, I didn't want to be in trouble, so I just agreed to everything. And the judge plays, like, the judge is so baffled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody's like, it's chaos, right? And then that's some of the most impactful parts of the movie as well, when Frankie's like, Tom goes to see him afterwards at the FBI safe house, and Frankie's like, like, I'm sorry, like, I don't even know what to do anymore, though. Like, I've kind of screwed myself here, right?
Yeah.
And Tom basically says to him, like, like, I know that you are a student of history. When the old Roman emperors would lose, they had the opportunity to commit suicide in order to protect their family.
Right.
And it's just the implication of, like, you need to fall on your sword.
Yeah, and then, what's his face? Harry Dean Stanton finds him dead in the bathtub.
Yeah.
I think they call that a Roman bath.
Right.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. It's funny because, anybody who's not at the top of the family uses honor. And that's part of the brainwashing of the family, and part of the brainwashing of any probably sort of structure like this, where the people at the top don't really follow their own rules, but the rules are meant to keep everybody else in line, right? And it's like the honor.
It's like, I make the rules, but they don't apply to me.
Yeah, like the honor only goes as far as Frankie. Like, Frankie's actually a relatively honorable person, but, like, Michael would never fall on his sword.
No, of course not. He'd fucking shoot his brother in the back of the head.
Yeah.
Or pay someone to do it.
Yeah.
No, it's very, it is a little confusing. Like, Frankie is about to demolish Michael, but then he sees his brother and recants. Is it kind of like, it's a little ambiguous. Is his brother reminding him of his Sicilian heritage, so he's not willing to do that? Or is it almost like an implied death threat?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you testify, we'll shoot your brother.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's more about honor. Like, his brother comes there because I think they say that his brother's like a very respected man back in Italy, and again, it goes back to the honor of, like, would you do this to your brother while the family is just as close as your brother would be to you?
Right, yeah.
So,
but even then, like, Michael and Tom Hagen basically browbeat him into committing suicide.
I think Tom is, appeals to Frankie's own reason and logic into doing it, right? I mean, at this point, Frankie's life is effectively over. Like, after perjuring himself there, like, you can guarantee that he's going to be thrown away forever. Like, the FBI are not going to allow that sort of and it's funny too, because right, like the FBI has their own code and has their own, like, dishonoring the FBI like that, they would have locked him up and thrown away the key too.
Even still, they still basically browbeat him into committing suicide because they don't want him revealing any secrets.
Yeah. I think the ultimate point of comparison that I want to make between Michael and Vito is, I think that Vito is a great man, and I think that this movie goes out of his way to show that Vito is a great man, and I think that the difference is that Michael is a powerful man,
not a good guy.
At the end of the day, like, I think that, again, this movie is deeply about capitalism versus the idealism that came before it, and, like, the trying to create a better life for your family. And again, this is very comparable to Breaking Bad, where at the beginning of the Breaking Bad series, it feels like Walter White actually does care about his family and wants to create this better life for them. But just like in Breaking Bad, it's very similar in the sense that, like, as you start to see everything, like, it becomes more and more clear, especially throughout this movie, that Michael doesn't really care about anyone else. Like, he just wants to further consolidate power and become wealthier.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't think legitimizing the business is actually even for the purposes that he told Kay. I think it's actually just because he sees more money in it.
No, really. Vito has that point in, like, part 1 where he talks about how, like, you know, he basically defends what he's done is just a legitimate way of providing for his family. And, like, I believe that Vito just wanted to provide for his family.
Yeah.
Michael, though, it's all about Bezoing and reaching space.
Yes.
You know?
Yep. Okay, so sequels, prequels, and reboots. So obviously, The Godfather Part 1 follows us. We talked about that. Godfather Part 3 comes out 16 years later in 1990. It's currently the final installment of the Godfather movie series.
And let's hope it stays that way.
Yeah, I've never seen Part 3. At some point, I will watch it, I'm sure.
You know what? It's probably not as bad as people say it is.
I don't know if I...
You know what, though? Like, I will say 1 and 2 form, like, a perfect duology.
They do. They
do.
It's tough even wanting to go back into the well for it, because they do just feel so perfectly attuned with each other.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting, though, is if you do want more, I would point you towards, like, the Godfather saga, which is, it was originally made for TV. It's the chronological cut of the Godfather Part 1 and Part 2.
Okay.
So it begins with Vito as a child and ends with Michael post Fredo murder. And the original cut, because it was for TV, they cut out some of the violence and the sexual stuff, but they actually added in a bunch of deleted scenes. I've seen really mixed stuff online. Like, some people have said that the pacing of it is much worse because of the way that it's kind of cut. Although what's interesting about it is it's almost like watching the machete order of the Star Wars movies, where it kind of makes the focal point actually Part 1, and then it's like the prequel, like the prelude to Part 1 in Vito's story, and then the conclusion, like the consequences of Part 1 in Michael's story to end with.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be interesting to watch it in that order, because you're essentially just watching half of Part 2, all of Part 1, and then the other half of Part 2.
Right, yeah. Huh.
So
I would check that out someday. That does sound interesting.
Yeah, I kind of do want to see how that changes the story, or my perspective of the story. There's also The Offer, which is the TV show about the production of The Godfather Part 1, which is amazing. It's on Paramount Plus, I think. I really liked it as a miniseries. It was really good. I think what's really interesting about this is that this was co-written by Coppola and Mario Puzo, and really only a little bit of Fredo's backstory is explored in the novels up to this point in time, and everything with Michael's character written post Part 1 is actually just the creation for this movie specifically. And they do get into some of this stuff in the later books because they actually do kind of write some of the stories afterwards. It's kind of like Game of Thrones right now if George R. R. Martin ever finishes another book. But...
Well, yeah.
They kind of wrote it together, and it was Coppola's idea to kind of do the dual narratives because that was something he apparently had wanted to do for a long time, was to show like two men in their 30s and like the contrast between the father and son.
Mm-hmm.
And I like as well that Mario Puzo didn't want Michael killing Fredo at the end of the movie, but then Puzo only agreed that Michael would wait until their mother died, which I love that idea. And I think that it fits really well into this story as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like Michael's mother is really the only connection Michael has left to the old world.
I really wanted more from Carmela in this movie.
Yeah.
Especially knowing that, especially with her passing in this movie, like, it's a shame. She's, like, barely a character.
Like, literally barely a character.
Yeah, she's just Vito's wife, Michael's mother. That's it.
So, effects and filming, this almost didn't happen. Like, part 2 almost didn't come to pass for a number of reasons. One part was because Francis Ford Coppola hated directing The Godfather Part 1 because see The Offer.
It's again, it's so baffling to me that it's like one of the greatest movies of all time, and yet he hated working on it.
Everybody hated working on it, I think.
Yeah, like it's so. Again, anytime like I'm feeling unsure about a creative project, I'm always like, I don't know, maybe it's a Coppola Godfather effect right now, right?
Yeah. Well, I was listening to another podcast recently, and they were talking about how like, you know, effectively, if you're in the film industry, like you're in it because you have like a sick passion for the art.
Sick passion.
And like you're essentially just like you have a compulsion to like churn out more and like create more, and it's like you don't even care about like what it's doing to yourself or, you know, like the time that you take, and like even making money like it is not really like a big thing. Like most directors don't make any money effectively.
I actually interviewed a director a few years ago, and he flat out admitted he has gone into crazy amounts of debt to finance his movies.
Right. Yeah.
So fuck.
Yeah. No, I believe it for sure. He didn't want to make this movie, and he agreed to actually produce it. He pitched Martin Scorsese to actually direct part 2.
Wouldn't that have been interesting?
I mean, we essentially got Goodfellas, right? Later.
Right.
So we'll talk about relationship to Goodfellas as well, because I think that's going to be an interesting part of the conversation about where these movies sit on what we like, our favorite movies of all time. But anyway, so the studio executives rejected Martin Scorsese directing this, which is kind of hilarious in hindsight. So Coppola agreed to direct it. Al Pacino said no initially because he didn't like the script like the day before they were going to start filming. And there's a lot of back and forth online about what exactly went down with that. I think the consensus is that Al Pacino said, I think this script can be better. Show me something better before I sign on to this. And Coppola did like a mad rewrite that night basically, and like pitched it to him the next day, and they went on with it. So
okay, you gotta imagine like that must have been like, because if Al Pacino says no, then like there's no movie.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, for sure. Right. So like literally that would have ended part 2 right there.
I gotta say, I listened to like a review of Al Pacino's autobiography. He is kind of a weird guy. You know, there's stuff about how like he just wouldn't, like he would get fired from jobs all the time because he just wouldn't show up because he just didn't feel like going.
Yeah, that's kind of a common thing, honestly. Like if you think about it, like Brando did that all the time.
Yeah, I guess when you're like that creative, you just
you're a little flaky.
You're a little flaky. Yeah.
Joaquin Phoenix has done that a few times.
Bill Murray.
Bill Murray. Yeah. Plenty of famous examples of that.
Apparently there's even this thing too, and I'm like, it's Celebrity Memoir Book Club. That's the podcast I listened to where they were talking about it. Apparently like he got into crazy amounts of debt because like he just is so bad at managing money. Like there's even stuff where like, you know, at one point he was looking into his finances and like apparently he had 13 phones that he was paying for, and he didn't even know where they were.
Oh my god. Yeah. I believe that though. Like I'm sure more creatives than not are bad with money.
I almost kind of admire it. It's like you're a true artist. You just are just like, ugh.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. So the idea for the miscarriage and the versus the abortion, Talia Shire actually pitched the abortion.
I love that a woman thought of that. Yeah.
It's really impressive, right? Because it is, like I said, it's one of the most epic portrayals in film history. And so that's why Francis Ford Coppola gave her that scene where she pleads to Michael to forgive Fredo, and that's why we get kind of that block of sequence, because Connie really isn't that impactful in this movie.
No, but like she's certainly there.
Right.
Right. She's there more than her mom is.
Yeah.
By the way, whoever they got to play like a young Carmilla, I was looking at her, I'm like, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah,
I believe you gave birth to Talia Shire.
Even more so than Vito, young Vito versus older Vito. Like, and it's kind of neat. They added like the Brando cheek,
like the prosthetic.
Yeah. They put a little prosthetic in the scene where he goes to see the other Don. Which actually, I was gonna say this before when we were talking about the Don's murder. The villa that Don lives at is actually the villa that later on in part, I guess later on chronologically, but in part 1, that's where the villa that Michael stays at when he goes into exile. So, so the implication is that after that Don is murdered, Vito takes over in that area of town as well.
Fuck yeah, he did.
His family, proliferates there. The other kind of implication as well is a lot of the scenes that they film of young Michael are actually shot on the same location, in the same streets as part 1, when Michael is on those streets in exile as well.
Huh. Well, fancy that.
Yeah, it's kind of cool how very subtly this movie references and calls back to the first movie.
What's that famous George Lucas quote where it's like, it rhymes. It doesn't repeat. It rhymes.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. It's little things, tiny details like that I really appreciate. Robert De Niro spent 4 months learning how to speak Sicilian to play Vito Corleone, and so he only I can't remember how many words it was. It was like 60 words or something like that he speaks in English in the whole movie, and the rest is actually in Sicilian.
Yeah,
it's kind of like a Sicilian-Italian mix. He's one of only I think it was 3 people who've won an Oscar for primarily speaking in another language. But we'll talk about Oscars a little bit later, I suppose. Don Fanucci, the mob boss, I guess not really mob boss, the extortionist of the Black Hand in Vito's timeline.
The fake mob boss.
Yeah, so he's based on Ignazio Lupo, called Lupo the Wolf, referred to in the Italian-American community.
Huh.
Yeah, so he was essentially like early mafia of that time period. Did you notice that Michael looked like older in that final shot of him?
A little bit, yeah.
And he's kind of alone. So they actually shot that scene, and their intention was to actually shoot like an older Michael and have his son Anthony show up, who was like 18 at this point, and say that he doesn't want to carry on the family business.
Mm-hmm.
And that was supposed to be kind of the conclusion of the movie, of like breaking the cycle, and that Michael again is truly alone. And they actually ran out of time to finish shooting that scene, so that's where like Michael's got the older kind of makeup on and making himself look older, but there's not really any explanation beyond that except he's just all alone by himself.
I think it works. It just makes him look like he just kind of looks haggard.
Yeah.
Like he hasn't been sleeping.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I agree. It's kind of like when you look at it, you're like, did they age Michael here for some reason? Like, it's something that I have noticed previously in that scene.
I think it's subtle enough that you can kind of just be like, right,
Yeah, it passes the test, but it's interesting that they were actually intending that for something else, and it didn't quite work out that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess we talked about cutting and the way that it's split between Vito and Michael. Originally, the cuts were actually much more rapid. Like there was a few minutes of one and then a few minutes of the other, and test audiences hated that.
I can see how that would be intensely frustrating.
I'd be interesting to see the initial cut now, though, because that's how a lot of TV works, and I think that audiences at that time probably would have had a harder time following dual narratives.
I think like if we're just going like scene by scene back and forth, I think the way they did, I'm not even 100% in love with the dual narrative, but like it was more like sequence to sequence.
Right.
I think that's significantly more powerful than just scene by scene.
Yeah.
I think if they did it scene by scene, you'd have a really hard time telling what was going on.
I don't know. And again, I'd be interested in seeing that cut of the movie just to see if the complaint is valid in 2025's viewing experience.
Potentially. I think I would have hated it.
It's tough to say like how frequently they actually did cut, because there's not really, I don't know that version exists currently.
Mm-hmm.
So, the dresses. I found this kind of interesting also just because I'm interested in money and inflation and how that stuff works. But so they said they stole $600 worth of dresses, right? That's what Don Fanucci kind of estimated that they probably stole.
Yeah.
And that he would want $200 from each of them. That would have been about a year's salary for the people who lived in Vito's neighborhood.
Wow.
But in today's dollars, or in 2023's dollars here, that's about $14,000. So these people are living in pretty impoverished conditions.
Yeah, they are dirt fucking poor.
Yeah. Look back at the times. I think that Hyman Roth's assassination was probably more impactful in the 70s, like only being 10 years removed from Lee Harvey Oswald's murder.
JFK.
Yeah. And all of that. So I think that would have hit probably a little bit harder back then. The golden phone scene with the president in Cuba, that actually is based on a real event that happened, and that phone actually exists and is in the Havana Museum of Revolution.
Huh.
Yep.
The Museum of Revolution.
Yeah, and so the phone that they created specifically for this movie actually looks pretty much exactly the same as the real phone.
Okay. Kind of neat.
Legacy of the movie. So this movie was nominated for 11 Oscars and won 6 of them. Let me read out the nominations for you, and I'll let you guess who won.
Okay.
All right, so nominations for Best Picture, Best Actor going to Al Pacino, leading role, Best Actor supporting role for Robert De Niro, Michael V. Gazzo, Frankie, Lee Strasberg, and Talia Shire, Best Actress supporting role. We've got Best Director, Best Writing Screenplay adapted from other material, Best Costume Design, Best Art Direction, and Best Music Original Dramatic Score. 6 winners. What do you got?
Okay, so I already know that De Niro and Gazzo won, so that's 2.
Yep.
I'm gonna go ahead and say Best Screenplay from Adapted Materials, Best Art, Best Costumes.
Yep.
I know Pacino didn't win. Did you say Best Picture in there?
Yes.
Okay, Best Picture. I'm going to say Best Picture 2. And I'm also going to say Best Director. Did you say that as well?
I said Best Director as nomination.
Okay, so again, I already know I already know that De Niro and Gazzo won. So again, I'm going to go Best Screenplay from Adapted Material, Best Costumes, Best Picture, and Best Director.
Okay. Best Picture wins. Best Supporting Role for Robert De Niro wins. Michael Gazzo does not win because he's competing against Robert De Niro and Lee Strasberg.
Oh, okay. I thought he won an Oscar. I thought you said he won an Oscar.
I thought he did too, actually. I think
Oh.
I did say that in the one, but he was nominated for the role.
Imagine losing out to a co-star. That's kind of an honor.
I mean, 3 people for this movie got nominated for Best Supporting, so which is wild. And then Best Director, Best Writing, Screenplay Adaptation, Best Art Direction, Best Score.
Okay.
So 6.
Fucking A.
This is actually the first movie sequel to win Best Picture. The only other movie that's ever won Best Picture. Can you guess what it is? Talked about it in this episode already.
Is it one of the Lord of the Rings movies?
See. Lord of the Rings, Return
of
the
King. Yeah.
Yes, won Best
I do
Picture.
remember that year. It just won. It was basically just like Lord of the Rings, Return of the King gets all the Oscars.
Yeah.
Good for them.
Currently on IMDb, this is number 4 highest rated movie of all time. This is Letterboxd number 6 highest rated movie of all time. Can you guess on both of those where Part 1 ranks?
Is it like just one notch higher for both?
So on IMDb, it's the number 2 highest rated movie.
So 2 higher.
Yeah, so I believe it goes Shawshank Redemption, Part 1, The Dark Knight, and then this movie.
IMDb can get fucked. That ranking system is so weird.
And then Letterboxd, it's number 6. Part 2 is number 6. Part 1 is number 12. Letterboxd likes Part 2 more.
Wow. Letterbox.
Part 2, AFI recognized this movie. So Michael Corleone, number 11 villain of all time. It has 3 nominated quotes and the top 100 movie quotes. and it's the number 3 highest rated gangster movie of all time. Top 3 highest rated gangster movies of all time. What do you think they are?
I think Goodfellas is number 1.
Godfather Part 1 is number 1, and then it's Goodfellas. And
Okay.
Personal reviews and the partner factor, kind of leading with that. I actually have those 3 movies ranked in the same order. I would rank Godfather Part 1 as my favorite gangster movie of all time.
Yeah.
Followed by Goodfellas, followed by Godfather Part 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would agree. It does seem like there's a general consensus that Part 2 is just not quite as good as Part 1.
It's very contentious, and honestly, I'm fine if you like whichever one you like. It's personal opinion. Like, these are both fantastic movies. You're kind of splitting hairs. For me, what kind of puts number 1 over Part 2 is that, again, I watched this movie intentionally not having watched Part 1 for a couple years.
Okay.
Because of missing kind of the complementary nature of Part 1, there's things in this movie that are more jarring without having that direct remembrance in my mind, and like the ideas of the first movie, and like seeing that contrasted in this movie, that hurts it a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
There's stuff with Mo Green and stuff like that you brought up a really good point, that doesn't feel as impactful if you're this far removed from Mo Green's storyline.
Yeah.
Right? So I think ultimately I can't rank Part 2 higher, even though there was a brief time when I had it ranked higher, because I watched both of them together and I was like, okay, Part 2 is a much more dense, complex movie than Part 1.
Yeah.
And I respect that a lot. Like, I respect the writing of Part 2. But without Part 1, it just doesn't quite work as well.
You know, and far be it for me to, like, you know, wag my finger at Francis Ford Coppola and Mario Puzo, but, like, I do feel like there are some writing blunders in the middle where, like, it's hard to tell what's going on, but that's just me.
And again, I think that's speaks to needing to watch this movie multiple times, and I know some people get upset when it's like, oh, I have to watch something multiple times to fully get it. And I get that. I get that. But I think, again, and I really harped on this in the primer episode, you need to watch these 2 movies together and consider them like 2 halves of a whole.
A companion. Yeah.
It'd be like watching Kill Bill Part 2 only, you know?
Yeah, I guess.
It's basically the same thing. So,
who is this lady with this sword? Why is she so mad?
Exactly. So, and to the credit of Part 1 as well, like, there's something so intoxicating about how well the first movie is made that when you're in this world, like, again, I deeply respect the writing of this movie and like all the themes and all of the things that it's reaching for, but there's just something so effective about Part 1.
I gotta say, Part 1 probably cracks my top 10.
Yep.
I don't know that Part 2 even cracks my top 50.
Really,
yeah.
Wow.
Sorry, I'm going there. Don't at me.
I mean, we're gonna do our top 100 movies later this year, but I think that mine are significantly closer together than yours, and that's partially because I've seen this movie a few times now and I've come to appreciate it.
Maybe
a lot
I'll
more.
watch it again before we do our top 100 and it'll go up a bit.
But again, you need to watch them together.
Right.
So you gotta have to find 6 hours, 7 hours.
I gotta put it's like a putting in a shift at work.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey. You know, I've got a flexible schedule. I could do that.
And I'd be interested to hear, like, when we do that, if either of us get the chance, we should try watching these movies in the, like I said, like the mini-series version, where it's like watch up to each intermission and then cut it off there, and like watch intermission, then after the intermission, then Part 2 up to the intermission, and then Part 2 finale, and see how that works watching these like that.
Yeah.
Because I think that actually helps this series as well, and I think that that's a good way to get into this series if you're not used to watching like 3-hour plus movies. Jess didn't watch Part 2 with me this time, but her and I watched Part 1 and Part 2 together 2 years ago.
Cool.
And she agreed that she thought Part 2 was a better movie.
Okay.
I agreed with her at that point in time, but again, coming to this movie by itself, and she didn't get to rewatch it with me this time, I did kind of lean more towards Part 1 after just watching Part 2.
Yeah.
Shall we wrap it up then?
Yeah. One thing I did want to point out, that it was just one random thought. Fredo has that throwaway line about how Carmela, his mom, used to joke that like she wasn't really his son, that like he was planted there by gypsies. Yep. I did find that kind of hilariously heartbreaking. Like, even your own mom didn't like you that much.
Right. I guess there's the contrast again about like him being the most genetically like Vito, like looking like Vito.
Yeah, I guess.
So.
But again, I even think that's part of the contrast in that, like, when Vito has the mustache and that look, he looks like suave and handsome.
Right.
And then when Fredo tries to pull it off, he just looks kind of like sketchy.
Yeah.
Skeevy.
Yeah. So.
Anyways, I think we've said enough, though.
We've said a lot. So
hey, I'm not editing this one. This is all you.
You might have to help me out. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will see you next time for a Canadian or other foreign international movie.
Woo!
So looking forward to it.
Woo woo.
All right. See you next time. Tell your dad.